unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to a special episode of Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. Last week, U.S. President Donald Trump issued an executive order slapping India with a 25% special tariff due to its purchases of Russian oil. This surprise measure raised the total tariff on Indian imports to the United States to 50%, among the highest rates imposed by the United States on any country in the world. But India is not just any country. Over the last quarter century, it's emerged as one of America's most valuable strategic partners. Trump's tariff move has plunged the bilateral relationship into crisis, raising difficult questions about the future of both U.S. and Indian foreign policy. To make sense of these developments and their global ramifications, I'm joined today by Grand Tamasha regular Sadanand Dhume of the American Enterprise Institute and the Wall Street Journal, and Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution. Guys, thanks for coming on.
Good to be back.
Good to be back as well.
So we are breaking our summer hiatus at the request, I should say, of several Grand Tamasha listeners to do a special emergency pod on Trump's tariff tantrum. And Sadanand, I want to start with you with a just kind of broad question about, really the, the question we've all been discussing privately over the last several days about how we got here. What to you is the most convincing explanation for Trump's decision to slap this kind of unprecedented 50% tariff on Indian exports to the United States?
Well, great question. And, I'm going to start by just pointing out that we're all speculating to a certain extent. But the way I see it, there are, three broad strands. The most important is what happened in the actual negotiations between the U.S. and India. Now, it appeared as though they were going very well. As your listeners are obviously aware, Modi had visited the U.S. in February, and the idea was that India would move very quickly to lock in at least some kind of preliminary trade agreement to avoid the looming threat of tariffs. Even on so-called Liberation Day, when Trump announced these tariffs on many countries, the mood in India was generally fairly optimistic and upbeat because they felt that India had the inside track, it had an early mover advantage, and things were moving towards a deal. They were also optimistic in India because I think there was a sense that India was willing to put more on the table than before, make concessions that it had not been willing to make before, and so on. Now, why didn't it work out? I think a few things happened. One, of course, is that what India characterized as a particularly generous deal may not have looked like a particularly generous deal from a U.S. perspective, especially when compared to other countries. For example, Indonesia went down to 0%. The Japanese made significant concessions. The Europeans made significant concessions. So what appeared from an Indian perspective to be unprecedented may still have appeared kind of meager from an American perspective. I think that's the gist of it. I also think there are a few other things going on which in the background. One is that I think Trump tends to look at the world through this historical lens, and he has long viewed India as particularly problematic. Going back to the first term, or even going back, before that, he sees India, not without reason, as a country that has particularly high tariffs. He's referred to India as a tariff king. Both of you would remember the incident in the first term over Harley Davidson's, where he was, kind of just focused very intensely on the idea that why was India charging such high tariffs on Harley Davidson's? So he already had this idea of India as a problematic player. And then the third strand, which I'm not entirely sure has something to do with this, but may have something to do with this, is that I think things have gone south in terms of the India-Pakistan dynamic, where, and we can get into this more later, where there was this short, sharp 4-day conflict in May. And immediately after that, Trump took credit. The Pakistanis were more than willing to give him credit and, in fact, nominated him for a Nobel Peace Prize. And the Indians have, I think, from a Trumpian perspective, been quite churlish about not giving him any credit. Obviously, from an Indian perspective, they think that this is the right thing to do, and how dare he take credit, and so on. But I think all that would probably, I imagine it probably would have, added to a kind of souring. And by all accounts, right now, he's quite sour on India. You have the 50%. You have the 25%, which was added on because of Russia. I don't think that has to do with India directly. I think that he was perhaps frustrated that the killing had not stopped in the war. And I think India is just a weaker target than, say, China that imports more oil. So I don't think that part was directly related to India. Then again, India, which was already in disfavor with Trump, ended up bearing the brunt of that too. And that's how we get to 50%.
Tanvi, anything you want to add on Sadanand's kind of three strands?
I think the one thing I would add, we've seen many of these issues that are kind of source of differences, whether it is Pakistan, whether it is Russia, whether it is trade or kind of economic differences more broadly, been an issue before, whether in the Trump administration or other U.S. administrations, even since U.S.-India relations have been on kind of an upward trajectory. To me, there are two things that make this moment somewhat trickier, not kind of irretrievable, but trickier. One is an element that is an addition or kind of the new thing in the mix, which Sadanand mentioned, which is the fact that this is personal for Trump. There seems to be a personal pique at India. And given his style, this actually matters in terms of his the relationship. And the second aspect is an element that is missing, which is convergence on China, which had incentivized both sides, I think, to cooperate over the last 20, 25 years, but also had incentivized the two countries to manage differences like the ones we've mentioned. That element is missing for both the reasons that we don't seem to have a singular sense of where Trump himself stands on China. You know, on the one hand, he seems to want to deal with China, which would be even worse from India's perspective, and the U.S.-India relationship would be impacted accordingly, or would be affected accordingly. But also the fact that, you know, if this element is missing, it doesn't give people that sense of what's that structural factor that Trump cares about enough, or what personal factor that's going to get people over the yes line, so to speak. So I think both this element of this being personal, but also the missing element of Trump either wants to deal with China or doesn't really care that much about China competition compared to these other issues, and particularly that personal or trade aspect, where he's willing to put that aside.
So Tanvi, let me just stick with you for a second. You're our resident historian. People have been asking me, I'm sure you've gotten the same questions, and you too, Sadanand, about, you know, whether this moment of kind of August 2025 is reminiscent of 1971 and Nixon's treatment of India and Mrs. Gandhi during the Bangladesh crisis. Some have said this is akin to 1998 and Clinton's slapping of sanctions on India after India's nuclear tests. You know, how do you put this in a kind of proper historical context, having kind of studied every administration post-independence until the present?
I think, you know, you could say it's too soon to tell, because, you know, it depends on if we see this downward spiral continue or the two countries find a path out, partly because, as we would have seen from the previous Trump term, now there are a lot of differences, but you can see from the previous Trump term, there were some pretty bad circumstances too. People have forgotten for some reason, but there were kind of Venezuela-Iran sanctions that affected India. There were CAATSA sanctions, if you remember. These were sanctions that would have affected India because of its defense purchases from Russia. There was Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan visiting the U.S. a few months after an India-Pakistan crisis, with President Trump saying, you know, he was going to mediate Kashmir. There was a U.S.-Taliban deal. And there were even attempts of U.S.-China, a U.S.-China deal. And these are just some of the few. There were personal insults against Prime Minister Modi. There were also kind of insults about India, about its what it was doing in Afghanistan, or calling India filthy. So it's not that these moments have not existed. And so, you know, I think on the one hand, we can see that India and the US might find a way out. So I think it's too soon to tell. Having said that, I do think, you know, the kind of 1971 and 1998, You could also answer your question by saying those are just very different, mostly because I think the US-India relationship before then wasn't exactly in a place that was in an upward trajectory, or there were these structural factors driving the relationship forward. So while they were both a shock to the system, particularly because India was in a very different situation economically, strategically, in both those moments, in a way that constrains its options. I actually do think India has more options, more cards today, but also that the US-India relationship has some structural realities that are being put on the line in this moment. And, you'd think that would drive both sides to kind of find a pathway out. But I think the jury's out on that, at least as we record. As we know in these days, things change by the hour, if not the day.
So, Sadanand, there's been a lot of second guessing going on amongst the kind of commentariat. And I guess the question I wanted to ask you is, do you think Modi could have avoided this fate, or was this a decision that would have been hard for the Indian side to have predicted? I want to goad you into maybe dredging up. I think it was a tweet of yours on May the 10th, was it not? where you was rather prescient in hindsight.
Yeah. So you can't do anything, coming back to my three strands, you can't do anything about the fact that, Trump has long viewed India as particularly problematic on trade. Right? You can't go back and rewire that. But on the other two parts, right, on how India approached the India-Pakistan issue and the role that the U.S. Played in that conflict, and on the part of trade, I think that you could certainly speculate, right? It's possible, for example, just sticking to trade first, it's possible to imagine an offer that India made that would have been acceptable. Maybe it wouldn't have been, 0% like Indonesia, but maybe it was possible to have some sort of, more leeway, for example, on agriculture, maybe something like soybean. Who knows? Maybe it was possible to toss in some kind of, and I think all of these are still possible, by the way. Maybe it was possible to toss in promises of investment of the type that we've seen other countries make, right? Maybe you get a group of Indian businessmen to pledge that they're going to invest whatever billions of dollars in the American economy. I think there was perhaps room to be creative and to offer Trump what looked like a win without, necessarily committing political harakiri for Modi. I do think that's sort of possible. I still think that's a possibility. I also think that, coming back to my tweet on May 10th, for which I've got a lot of flack, I think that India could have very quickly after the ceasefire thanked Trump, thanked Vice President Vance, thanked Rubio, because it was very clear from the first day that India's objective was limited. Right? India's messaging right from the very start was that it wanted to retaliate for the awful massacre at Pahalgam, but it was not interested in a wider conflict. And the conflict did end in 4 days. India, I think, did inflict more damage. I think it came out, I think most neutral observers agree that it came out ahead, in case if you're just sort of doing the math, both in terms of sort of military damage inflicted, but also in terms of, the political messaging of, striking targets in the Punjab heartland of Pakistan and so on. And I think India could easily have sort of said that, well, we've achieved our objectives and we thank our friends for helping us achieve those objectives. Or it could have, it depends on, you can find many very different ways to phrase it. So I think if you would sort of put these together, it was certainly possible to imagine another outcome.
And just on that, we've been discussing, and you alluded to this in your answer, that it's still not too late for India to announce pledges of investment or to make steeper cuts in agricultural tariffs. But do you think it's too late on the Indo-Pak ceasefire front, because now Modi is a bit painted into a corner?
Yes, I do. I think that moment passed, and I think it was already it was made difficult to begin with by Trump. If Trump had held his horses for a few hours and allowed India to thank him first before he jumped in, the moment he tweeted about it, before the Indians had a chance to tell their own people, he already made it difficult for Modi. So I think in that, that's clearly an example of diplomatic malpractice by Trump. Now, of course, it would be out of the question, because it would be viewed as the most craven kind of kowtowing, and there's no way that any Indian leader could be expected to do that. So I think that, there was a moment that moment has passed.
Tanvi, you've been following probably more closely than anyone the government of India's response, going through and reading very carefully with the benefit of having read thousands of these MEA statements. How do you assess the official governmental response on the Indian side? And do you think there's scope for fruitful negotiations, in the coming days and weeks?
I think, what we've seen is in some ways almost a three-track response. We've seen a response at the leader level where the prime minister has in fact held fire. He has not targeted Trump himself. In fact, it is notable. I don't know how long it lasts, but it's notable that as of this recording, while Trump has criticized India, he has not criticized Modi personally. Now, he does seem to actually have fond feelings for the prime minister. It might be why he's actually feeling more aggrieved about not being, thanked. But nonetheless, he hasn't done that. Having said that, I think you've seen the prime minister also not respond in a way that some on social media would like him to, right? Go on a tirade or that some on social media have, which is, call the relationship into question, target the U.S., target President Trump himself. So you've seen that he has held fire for now. He has, however, made statements, alluded to the fact that he's not going to give up on some core interests in terms of on the agriculture and dairy side, while still, I think, leaving some space if they wanted and needed to make adjustments there, I think. Then you see that's the leader level side. I think you then see kind of a bureaucratic response, which is both on the lines of, statements from MEA, again, not directly, not like a frontal assault, but kind of alluding to or subtweeting, expressing opposition to the stance the U.S. has taken without necessarily, attacking the U.S., saying that it disagrees, trying to point out certain hypocrisies, but not beyond a point, crossing lines that would be harder to walk back from. And then also on the bureaucratic side, you have seen kind of India keep open and say we're going to continue to try to negotiate on the trade side, leaving that door open. Some of this might be to see, where the Russia talks, President Trump's meeting with Putin, where that goes. It might be to actually suss out, is there a deal even possible here? See if Trump actually moves on to something else. So I think they've left some space on the bureaucratic side. And I think then you've seen kind of a political response, which is understanding. And I think this is particularly because the people who seem the most aggrieved about this in some way are members of, there's the people who are always been America skeptics in India. And I would say that is a dominant view in the strategic elite. This relationship has moved forward, not because of them, but almost despite them. So I'd set that aside. Yes, I think what the U.S. needs to worry about is there are people who've been supportive of the India relationship, including within government, whose hands have been weakened considerably, or case has been weakened considerably. But I would say otherwise, the most aggrieved people have seemed to be from the prime minister's own base, who seem to have thought that President Trump would be, very good for India, or at least, much, much better, because they had a view that the Biden administration wasn't, that you'd be much, much better. They seem particularly aggrieved. You've heard some of them use the word betrayal, etc. And so for that political, almost to create some political space, you've seen on that political level, both kind of as, as I said, the statement to say, okay, we're not going to give up interest, but also then, putting out, sources being told also, and reporting things like, oh, the prime minister is going to do more with China, or Putin's going to come to India. Now, Putin was always going to go to India because this is his turn for the annual summit, or, portraying National Security Advisor Doval's visit to Russia as part of the response to the U.S. And you hear a lot of, oh, this will show the U.S. Honestly, I don't know that anybody in the U.S. is paying that much attention. And particularly, I don't know if President Trump has. The risk is, of course, with the political, you can tell that it's the government's need to create some space for itself. plus creating space for some potential deal if they want to take that pathway. The challenge here is needing to calibrate. So some of that political messaging, like somebody seemed to be putting out there, the US is going to, or India is going to cancel all defense deals and do this and that it has the potential to actually create a backlash with Trump. So, he will double down on this because he doesn't like, for instance, India doing things like BRICS, etc., even as he reserves the right in his mind to parlay with Russia, China. Very quickly on, is there scope for negotiations? I do think there is. I think, for the reasons on the lines that Sadanand talked about. Also, I think amongst, the more pragmatic people who understand that this relationship has a lot of emotions involved sometimes, but it has never been about emotional drivers. This has been a pragmatic relationship, and that this relationship at the end of the day, for strategic and economic reasons, has mattered to India. And so you're not going to see, you will see that India will continue to kind of find these spaces with other countries. Yes, but that was always going to be the case. India was always going to continue to deal with Russia, always continue to try and diversify through other partners. And at the moment you saw a Trump election, that India was going to continue to move forward to stabilize the situation with China. So I think you'll see all that, but I think there is scope because rationally, even with China and Russia, India has more space when it has a good working relationship with the US. I think one thing, though, there has to be an understanding in Delhi of is, and for some reason, I think this has almost been a forgotten lesson of the first Trump term, but I do think this term is somewhat different. I think people need to rethink engaging with the US. And this is not just India, every country. This administration is functioning much more like a royal court or a darbar than it is a normal US government. Trump 1.0 functioned somewhere in between. But I think given that there needs to be an understanding that the president's instincts matter far, far more, and his sentiments matter far, far more than they did in the first term. And there are not that many pushes and pulls from others as they were in the first term. And so I think the constituencies around are different, and I would say more limited. And you need to understand that as thinking about that darbar, and you have to understand court politics and who the characters that actually matter are.
Sadanand, let me take this to the kind of opposite end and ask you about the kind of domestic political considerations in India. You're in touch with friends, with family, with contacts there on a regular basis. How would you describe to a sort of layperson what the sentiment of the quote-unquote street is in India? What's the mood back home amongst those who are following along and at least paying some minimal amount of attention to this tariff affair?
It shouldn't come as any surprise to anyone that India is a very nationalistic country. And I think that the general mood of nationalism in the country has only grown over the last 11 years since Prime Minister Modi became Prime Minister. So there's the dominant view is one of defiance. The dominant idea is that India will never bend the knee and India will never bow, and everybody else is and nobody else has any self-respect, but India has loads of self-respect, and it's a sort of it's the usual. And so I'd say that's that defines the mood on the question of tariffs and on some of the and some of the things that some of the language Trump has used, for example, describing the Indian economy as dead and so on. So that's sort of that there's a lot of hyper nationalism going on. I'd say if you step back a little bit, what's more interesting in a way was the mood after the end of the conflict on May 10th. And there, I think that there is a kind of souring on the government, even among its own most ardent supporters, because I think what they expected was, in boxing terms, what they expected and what they were led to expect by India's half-crazed jingoistic media was a knockout, right? Like Mike Tyson going up against some scrawny 8th grader. And what they got instead was a decision on points. And it's a decision on points where I happen to think that India did prevail. But there are many people, and particularly in Pakistan, who think Pakistan came out ahead on points. But either way, I think that the conflict itself, the way it ended up being resolved was certainly something that hurt Prime Minister Modi much more than it helped him. And I think that has also served to tie his hands both in terms of, what we talked about earlier, in terms of being, more openly sort of gracious about the role that the U.S. played in all of this, but also in terms of how much he can give, because he's already, in a sense, on the back foot because of the way things panned out there.
So let me just ask you one follow-up to that, which is, how vulnerable is Modi at home? We've seen the opposition hammering the government day in, day out, deploying this tagline, Narendra surrender. There are many people, as you mentioned, in the BJP ecosystem unhappy with the government for agreeing to a ceasefire with Pakistan. Now there's a sense that further concessions to Trump could, add more fuel to the fire. I mean, is there a legitimate political threat given the state of the BJP and, frankly, the state of the opposition and the makeup or lack of makeup of the India alliance?
So it depends on your baseline, right? I think that if you start with the baseline that last year Modi came down from 303 seats to 240, that says something, right? So obviously the government is and the ruling party and the prime minister are not as popular as they were 5 years ago. I think we can all agree about that. We can also, I think, all agree that anti-incumbency really is a thing in India. And, what I've sort of the point that I've made in the past is that, typically any government, at least since the 1960s, typically if a government serves 10 years, by year 8, people are pretty unhappy with it. You saw that with, Indira Gandhi, with Navnirman starting in around 1974 and so on. You saw that with Manmohan Singh, where by year 8, the wheels were really coming off with all the kind of corruption scandals and so on. And it's to Modi's credit, and it kind of points to the fact that he's this remarkably gifted politician, that he's managed to push that off. And so he has not he did not face the kind of anti-incumbency towards the end of his second term that previous governments have. But I don't think that even Modi can ward it off forever. So I think that he goes into this, because he's a third-term prime minister, he goes into this weaker than before. And so obviously, given that background, that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that elements of his own base are upset with how this has turned out. And the third thing, which, and if I was in his position, I would worry about the most, is that the potential economic costs that would be paid should these tariffs go into place would certainly be high, and they would be felt on the ground. And I don't think that there'd be a way to disguise that or pretend that it hadn't happened. Now, something you alluded to in your question, which I think is true, is that on the other side of the ledger, you do have an opposition that is the kind of opposition that every political party in the world would only hope for. So he's, that he has going for him. That seems to be a permanent feature. But I think that even, given all the deficiencies of the Indian opposition, it's still a somewhat trying situation for the BJP.
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. Tanvi, let me zoom out back to foreign policy. I'm wondering about kind of where India goes from here. This week, we saw the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval land up in Moscow to meet the Russian leadership, including Vladimir Putin. Modi will soon be going to China for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit and meeting Xi Jinping. What does this turn of events mean for Indian foreign policy? I mean, is it essentially a huge victory for the proponents of multi-alignment?
I see hear a lot of folks saying, oh, this is going to mean India is going to return to strategic autonomy or return to multi-alignment. It never went anywhere away from that. The contours, and I think the emphasis within might be different, and I think that could be affected, and I'll come to that in a second. But I think we have to kind of think about this from what things are versus, what the headlines were. that you always had India want to keep that diversified portfolio of partners, and nothing about what Modi had done with the US had changed that. India had continued to maintain that relationship with Russia, and that even with China, you didn't need the US doing anything for Prime Minister Modi to try once, twice, one could argue even 3 times now, this third ongoing effort to try to stabilize ties, if not do more. I think where you will see the biggest impact is one thing the Prime Minister had done is be much more forward-leaning with the US. That was partly because of his own instinct. I think he post-independence Prime Minister, spent time in the US himself, had nothing in terms of ideologically as such against the US. And so he'd said, I think, yes, where others might have said no in certain instances. This was also pushed along by, obviously, a China threat, which is far larger for India, contrary to what social media might say, than anything in terms of the challenges the US poses to India. But I think what has happened is, the longer this continues and if the downward spiral continues, what this would have done is weakened the hands of those within the government who had been advocating for a closer relationship with the US, even if not an alliance, which has never been on offer really, or not any time in recent years. But to those who say, you will have a group of people who will say that, look, we shouldn't deepen ties. We should buy our defense equipment from elsewhere, not from the US. We should do much more on our own and, in fact, try to actually keep the US out in certain spaces. Now, others would argue, well, India was doing that anyway, which is, building at home defense capabilities, buying from Europe, etc. But I think, you will see a more diffident India if this goes sour from a US interest perspective, where India will just be much more difficult. I don't think recent generations know how difficult, when US-India relations are difficult, how difficult a regional situation, or even in global forums to the extent they matter, how diffident India could be to the detriment of US interests. So I think there could be an impact. And the other thing is, Modi had done things with the US, said yes, because the street seemed to be, as the Indian external affairs ministers have pointed out, whatever the strategic elite thought, the street seemed to be US friendly. If that continues to change and become more sour, if the street turns on India, I don't mean social media, I mean the genuine street, and this could be made worse if you see actions on H-1Bs and things like that. I think the high-skilled worker visas that some people have called for an end to, or severe restrictions on in the US, I think then you see them having much more an impact on the US-India relationship. But I think people who think there are silver bullets in terms of India moving towards Russia and China even more than it has, or somehow BRICS is going to be the answer, I think, they need to be a little more pragmatic about this. Russia does not offer, beyond a certain few things, Russia does not offer, is not relevant to a number of economic and technological questions for India, where the US has proved to be the answer, or the West has proved to be the answer. It is still limited, and as long as it is obsessed with, Putin's own kind of war, that's not going to change anytime soon. And China, at the end of the day, this is a country that didn't just say something in a tweet about a ceasefire. It actively helped Pakistan with arms, with intelligence, with diplomatic backing, and with disinformation during this recent India-Pakistan crisis. Moreover, in the last few months, it has been actively, forget tariffs, it's actually actively been cutting off supplies of things like fertilizers and rare earth magnets and stuff to India. So, this idea that somehow, yes, India will stabilize ties with China, that's what it's been doing. But to think that somehow China is going to give India a better deal, China is more likely to give India a good deal when India has a good US partnership, because then India has that card to play. The US relationship, amongst other things, gives India negotiating leverage and diplomatic space. It's not that India can't or won't necessarily do more with China, open up certain things, but they will be on worse terms than they would have been if there had been a better U.S.-India relationship. So I think I don't think you're going to see fundamental changes, but I think you will see potentially the space that Modi has to do certain things with the U.S. change, even as the space to do things with Russia and China, I don't think are that much more than they were before.
So I just want to add to that, very quickly, Milan. I agree with Tanvi's sort of two main points, right? That first of all, that the Indian strategy has always involved a large element of diversification. So, the media can make much of Doval going to Moscow or whatever, but India was never, even in 2022, India was never willing to completely cut off its relations with Russia. It was not willing to condemn the invasion of Ukraine, for example, which came as a shock to many people in the system in the US. So that diversification has always been a part of India's foreign policy. That's nothing new. The second thing I want to agree on is that the US-India relationship, the gains that we've seen have been incremental. But I do want to point out that it's kind of ironic that the Trump administration has done this, because if you were to sort of, at least from my perspective, looking at it, the gains have been incremental, but they have been real. For example, on technology, India is very, very clearly in one camp. Much more so, in fact, than other countries like Indonesia, right? In terms of shutting out China and embracing the US, for example. The fact that India under Modi had signed the so-called foundational agreements for deepening defense cooperation. So the incremental gains are not trivial. They were real. And this administration, I would argue, came into office with an opportunity to speed up those incremental gains that was greater than any previous administration in this century has had. And so it's quite ironic that the administration that had a chance to really cement and accelerate progress on the U.S.-India could end up actually, reversing that. And again, things aren't going to be black and white. But there could be, significant damage if you have things moving incrementally in the direction of deepening cooperation, and you start having some kind of reversal. It's not as though U.S.-India cooperation goes to zero, but if the direction changes, I think that is really significant.
So, Sadanand, let me just kind of follow up in one thing, which is that we have these lines that we trot out, and I think probably all of us have used them at some time, about talking about how for the past 25 years, quarter century, there has been a bipartisan consensus about needing to deepen and broaden the relationship, both in the United States as well as in India. So it really doesn't matter who's in power. Democrats, Republicans, BJP, Congress have broadly speaking kind of endorsed that compact. But what's surprising in a way, right, is like there's been very little pushback in the U.S. political context on Trump's targeting of India. So if ties were really that robust and kind of deeply shared from the left to the right, everyone in between, wouldn't we see opposition? I mean, I'm not saying they would change Trump's mind, but I mean, do you feel that there's a sense of people agitating and speaking out, or is it just drowned out amongst all the noise and the tweets and the everything else?
No, I think that's a really good question, right? And I guess my explanation would be that a few things. One is that it's certainly true that if you were, to talk to Democrats and talk to Republicans and say, do you think you should have a strong U.S.-India relationship is in Washington's interest? Most of them would say, yes, of course. I think India greatly overestimated just how much mind space India occupies in Washington. It's not that much. So that's the first part that's important, that of course, people agree in theory, but India has not been and is not top of mind. So it may be important in theory, but not important enough for this to become something that's that rises to the top in terms of urgency. I think that's one part of it. The second part of it is that in many ways India has been losing friends over the last 10 years, and particularly on this question of Russia, you could have many people who would be who would like to see a closer U.S.-India relationship, but were deeply upset by Putin's invasion of Ukraine and what they saw as India's amoral stance. I'm not saying that, I'm not getting into whether this was right or wrong. I'm just saying that is that's a very powerfully felt view in Washington. And then finally, on the Republican side, I'm quite sure that there are many serious people who would not like to see Trump take a wrecking ball to a relationship that Republican presidents have had as much of a role in building as Democratic presidents, right? I mean, let's not forget the nuclear deal and under the Bush administration and so on. But it's just the nature of the Republican Party at this moment, to come back to something Tanvi talked about earlier, right? This is an imperial presidency and nobody wants to cross the king. And if the king is upset, then they're just going to, hold their counsel. At least it seems like that. Whereas if it had been a more normal administration, I imagine that we would probably be hearing more, for example, from Republican senators and Republican members of the House than we have so far.
I think the other kind of missing element here is, which you see sometimes in the China context, is American businesses going to bat for a relationship. And at least publicly, we haven't really seen that this time. And, it's still, I think, not exactly clear to me whether that is because they might be saying things privately and they think it's better to, take these things up privately. They think it'll have more of an effect. Whether they have too many other interests with the Trump administration that they don't want to call into question by taking him on or kind of opposing his view, whether they think that it'll be a vulnerability if they go to bat for India because essentially, he's actually trying to get them to come back here and do more business here, not in India. Or if, as to Sadanand's point, just like the mind space in Washington, that at the end of the day, India also doesn't necessarily have the kind of mind space or constituencies on Wall Street that China does, in the sense that while India matters as a market to many of these companies, it is not kind of that important to them. Or another factor, which is that somehow these companies don't understand that if things go south, there will be no part of the relationship that will be insulated from this. From the fallout, that they need to understand that this is the time to speak up and try to be helpful rather than stay silent. Now, that could be behind closed doors, but that if they think the commercial interests in India are important, or India is a source of talent, or India as somewhere they want to actually sell their products, I think this is the time they might actually want to think about how they are engaging on this relationship, because this will not stay insulated if things go further or become worse.
But Tanvi, I mean, that if it comes to the question of, like, there've been a lot of comparisons about why did Trump back down when it came to China, and I still think he may back down when it comes to India too, right? I've been emphasizing from the start, and I think what you hear most often is that because China had the ability to inflict real pain on the American economy, right? Magnets, rare earths, various things. And it's not clear whether India has the ability to inflict pain on the U.S. economy without inflicting equal or greater pain on itself, right? So I've seen some of these sort of, hotheads on Indian social media say that, well, India should retaliate by going after global capability centers in India. And I'm like, yeah, right. So you want to, retaliate by blowing your own head off, right? So that, I think that in a way that's kind of also contributed to this, mood of anger and mood of confusion, which is that there's a sort of realization that even though the media tom-toms this idea that, India is going to be the fourth largest economy very soon and the third largest also quite soon, that in many ways it doesn't have the same kind of economic or geopolitical leverage that China does.
I think, this goes back to a point that, all of us have talked about on the pod, but we get yelled at for saying it, that this idea that many people seem to believe in kind of at least the Indian Twitter sphere, but sometimes in real life too, right? That India is more important to the US than the US is to India. When you actually say that, no, that's not the case, you just have to look at the metrics of the relationship. Forget anything else. Forget the fields. Look at just facts and figures. This is something, this moment where, that reality, I think, and by the way, I don't think the government necessarily has had this view, or at least the key people. I do think this is more kind of something that's discussed in public. I think the government has been more realistic, which is why you've seen in the past that it's not just been Washington who has tried to kind of manage differences or others make compromises. India has too. And so I think, this idea that, you are going to, you're going to just naturally be important is being called into question. I think, on the other one that, people are like, let's boycott McDonald's and KFC and support local businesses and farmers, without thinking about the fact that those companies source from Indian farmers and are run by local businesses. There's also the fact that the reality that for both those companies, I suspect if you look up the numbers, their revenues from India is probably a very, very small percentage. Yeah. So I think, but I still think, if you're thinking about it has been the case that the corporate sector has been a driver in U.S.-India ties. I just think it is something that is, it's as an option, as a diversification option, as an option. This is something I don't know that they're going to go and take on Trump on this, but I just hope they're not making judgments on the basis of that their part of the relationship will stay isolated.
So before we wrap up, I want to ask you both about kind of this head-spinning turn on Pakistan, right? We saw the Pakistani army chief back in the United States this most recent weekend. He's reported to have given quite an inflammatory speech in Florida. This was at a closed-door, off-the-record event, but it was recounted to Praveen Swami at the Print. And I just want to read out one quote that General Munir made, which was quite shocking and somewhat incoherent also. It was as follows. I am going to use a crude analogy to explain the situation. India is a shining Mercedes coming on a highway like a Ferrari, but we are a dump truck, we Pakistan are a dump truck full of gravel. If the truck hits the car, who is going to be the loser? Sadanand, let me just start with you. Help me make sense of what is going on with Pakistan. I mean, I certainly would not have predicted this. I'm still gobsmacked. There was a big story today in the FT detailing kind of what was happening behind the scenes between the Trump administration and people close to the regime, if not inside the regime. How do you explain this to, a layperson?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think we should start by saying that Indians should be very pleased that Munir thinks that India is a shining Mercedes turning into a Ferrari. It's not something that we hear very often. So they should start by thanking him for that. Secondly, on a more serious note, I think it's completely preposterous that a country's de facto leader can be this irresponsible when it comes to threats of using nuclear weapons. And that too, not even in his own country, on American soil. So that really is, that sort of goes to the problem of Pakistan as this rogue state. And the Pakistani army really being central to that. But, this mystery, right? Who would have predicted that Pakistan, of all countries, is going to, end up figuring out how to work the Trump administration just better than just about anybody? There are a few things, right? First of all, I think historically, the Pakistanis, to their credit, they have done they have a record of playing a weak hand deftly. And they do that by focusing on very real, short-term, tangible objectives, and by figuring out how to make themselves useful to the administration in power in the U.S. And this sort of thing, it sort of sounds very simple when I put it that way, but it's just something that Indian administrations maybe are getting better at, but have just never really had the handle of. India has been too slow, too ponderous, too lumbering, too preachy, too full of itself, and so on. And Pakistan just doesn't have any of that package, right? That's one part of it. The second is, I think that there's a particular problem in the Trump administration with, how do we put it, delicately? Let's just say a lack of historical depth and understanding. Now, if anyone who has studied Pakistan and sort of, and spent any time, looking at U.S.-Pakistan relations, would laugh in the face of a Pakistani who told you that, look, hey, guess what? We've got this great, we're gonna make you rich with critical minerals, or this promise of non-existent oil. That hey, guess what? You can come and invest in our oil. I mean, I just think that India should have done the same thing. It should have sort of claimed that it's sitting on the world's largest reserves of natural gas and oil, and that the US can. So, I mean, some of it is just, it's almost funny. And I don't think that an administration which had people who had spent time working on Pakistan seriously would have been taken in. The third element, and this is something that's been reported by the Wall Street Journal, is that there could be some kind of, familial angle with the cryptocurrency and companies that are, that started by the president's children and so on. Again, I'm not an expert on cryptocurrency, but I do know a thing or two about Pakistan. On the face of it, it's a scam, but it's a scam that works for Pakistan. And I think in the time that it takes the president and the people around him to figure out that it's some kind of scam will be sort of 3 years later. And in the meantime, the Pakistanis are going to be in a good position. So that's what I think is happening. I think that, and then the other thing is, of course, something I alluded to earlier, was that, they are willing to be charming, and they don't think being charming is a sign of weakness. So they were sort of, they recommended that the president be nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize and so on. Whereas I think that the sort of, the Indian system kind of hobbles itself because they're always sort of, there's a kind of worry that if we're too thankful, will that be interpreted as us being weak? And the Pakistanis have no such qualms. Obviously, it means that people on, Indian social media will go on about how Pakistan is horrible and has no self-respect and so on. But I think they can live with that as long as it gives them real concrete gains with the U.S. administration.
I think, it's one just on the General Munir speech. Forget admitting that India is like a shining Mercedes turning into a Ferrari. Can you imagine any leader from India, from China, or others going and referring to their own country as a dump truck full of gravel?
Well, at least he didn't say it was filled with garbage.
But the bar is so low. But it also, tells you, here's, and, in the speech, he also reportedly said that we'll take the whole world down with us if people should.
Right.
Half the world, Tanvi, was being moderate. Steve Cohen, who I worked for, and many have now rediscovered him because of Steve's quote from, I think it was his idea of Pakistan book. I should know, I helped work on it. That Pakistan negotiates with the guns to its own head. But it, if you're saying that, okay, look, that's the focus, it tells you all you need to know about the Pakistani military. That your kind of entire focus has been not on, thinking about the future or thinking about positives, but thinking about how the negative aspects of your kind of threats of either, these terrorist groups based in Pakistan or kind of nuclear weapons, how the focus on this, constantly focusing on challenges and threats and obsessions with, India, rather than actually thinking about, to use Trumpian terms, how to make Pakistan great. And, in the meantime, you've seen not just India, but Bangladesh surpass Pakistan economically and otherwise. And so, if this is what Munir seems to be, he's not a departure from his predecessors or many of his predecessors. In that sense, it's not that surprising. But I do think, to some of the points on that Sadanand made, I think Pakistan has, the reason they succeeded for now, is that they understood the nature, I think, of this imperial presidency. And they didn't, like they have in the past, they didn't try to understand necessarily America's priorities, but I do think they have done some of that. They, I think, somehow figured out both that the priorities that matters are the president's, and to understand how you get enough of a constituency around so people who care about particular issues that are going to go to bat for you as well. And so I think it's crypto, yes. It's also, promising critical minerals, but there are other things, on counterterrorism. They might be very unhelpful, if not the actual problem when it comes to India. But it's back to the early 2000s playbook, right? Every time things are bad, you just pick up a new number 3 of Al-Qaeda and look who we found in our backyard.
And they found him in inverted commas or quotation marks, just before the State of the Union address, right? So that Trump has a win to present. There's also a couple of other things. One, the Nobel Peace Prize. I think they understood that Trump was quite serious about this and he really wants this. And they are wanting to say that, look, we're the ones who will give this to you. I think another aspect, which we don't know the contours of yet, but it's clear that they have offered to play a role or have played some role in diplomatic negotiations with Iran. They've offered on China. And I think the third potential element, we don't know, did they play a role with the Azeris in this Armenia-Azerbaijan thing? And then, the thing that they might have hinted at, though I don't know how they deliver that without it's the one place there might be political costs in Pakistan, is if they have promised that if the Saudis and others normalize relations with Israel, that they will too. So I think they have figured this out. Now, let's see how long it lasts, because I think the other thing is the Pakistani military doesn't necessarily care about delivering. They have been promising things to the U.S. which they have either not promised or not delivered or actively worked against U.S. interests. Yeah. So let's wait and see.
So let me ask you one final question and just ask you both to kind of speculate a bit here. We're interrupting our hiatus to do an emergency pod. And obviously the question on everyone's mind is, where is this going? Sadanand, let me start with you. I mean, what's your sense? Do you think by the end of the summer we will have some kind of resolution that both sides can live with? Or do you think that this could really drag out and spiral further? Obviously, there's no way of knowing, but given everything you've seen so far and your knowledge of U.S.-India relations going back some time, what's your gut telling you?
Well, my gut is telling me that the extreme pessimists are going to be proven wrong. I think that you can find a way out of this. It's going to require a certain amount of creativity, but I think that you can find a way out of this that makes sense for both of the countries, but also makes sense for the political leadership in both countries. There's a way where this can be presented as a great win for President Trump and a win for Prime Minister Modi, while at the same time deepening the relationship. I'm not saying we'll necessarily get to that, and I think the fact that things have sort of reached this point, we're interrupting your vacation to have this conversation, shows that obviously everything is not hunky-dory. But I'm certainly not as pessimistic as the dominant mood is in India.
Well, could I just kind of one clarification question? How much stock do you put into the daily op-eds about how this could be the 1991 moment redux for India? I mean, there's a difference between making a deal and actually doing significant reform, and the two aren't necessarily connected.
Yeah, so I'm unfortunately, I'd love to be optimistic there. I'm not optimistic. Coming back to the point I made earlier, that I think that Modi already, he enters his third term facing headwinds. He has proven time and time again over the last 11 years that even where his instincts have been in the right place on economic reform, that he has been very, very sensitive to political pushback. We saw that on land, we saw that on labor, we saw that on the farm laws. I just don't see him as a political leader who has stomach for sweeping reforms. Obviously, I'm cheering all those people who want to see a 1991 moment, and as the saying goes, from their lips to God's ear. But if you ask me for my assessment, I don't think it's particularly realistic.
Tanvi, I know as a historian, you hate to be put in this position of having to predict the future, but nevertheless, I'm going to ask you, what's your sense about, where this thing goes in the next few months?
The history of Trump has told me that the only constant is volatility and the only predictable thing is unpredictability. So we shall see. And I do think this will come down to the calculations and the thinking of both the principles involved, because I think that's going to, both in terms of is President Trump willing to take wins if he's given them, or he just see a win sometimes, he changes his mind. We saw that in the first term. Or he decides that, no, this is not something that, he wants that thank you, which I do not think he's going to, he might get a roundabout thank you of some sort, but he's not going to get, if he really wants, and we don't know that he wants, a photo op with Indian and Pakistani officials or leaders together. So I think it depends on, also whether Prime Minister Modi decides that for India's own growth, and security. He needs to be and will be willing to expend some capital to try to keep this ship steady. He's done it before in times of tension, and frankly, people have made this political in India. I understand why the opposition is doing this to some extent, but they are not. Both sides have made foreign policy political, and one would say the BJP started this in some ways in 2014 after the. Or I think it might have been in 2017 during one of the India-China crises. But I do think the opposition is being somewhat forgetful that they too have kept the U.S.-India relationship steady and made stepped back and made some compromises when necessary, because they understand fundamentally this relationship isn't India's. Just like I don't think the U.S. has been altruistic. I don't think this has been a dispensable relationship for India either. So I think stepping back and trying to keep the focus, but I think it's going to, for India, it's actually going to be needing to focus on and think about what the value proposition of the U.S. is. That's going to be the calculation. But I think on the U.S. side, I don't think this is the India-U.S. relationship is why Trump's going to change his mind. I don't know that he cares about these things like a normal president. I think it has to be whether he thinks this is a winning relationship or he gets something that shows a win. As for I'll end with saying your 1991 moment. I think listeners might have heard me say this on the pod before. I said this, in fact, when things look good between Trump and India, that I think for India's own reasons, whether it's 1991 or anything, at the end of the day, autonomy comes from capabilities. Partnerships have helped India build those capabilities. But at the end of the day, if you want to take full advantage of those partnerships, whether with the US, whether with others, you have to create that environment. And so to me, the best thing India could do is a 1991 moment. We have seen these moments. The window of opportunity for that has been open for a while. And we haven't seen that moment. So if the prime minister, as he said, is willing to take some political risk and be, negatively affected, I would say take the risk on some of those reforms that will really, I think, set the ground for India having much more leverage and space with all its partners, not just the U.S.
Okay, we will leave it there. Tanvi, Madan at the Brookings Institution, Sadanand Dhume of AEI and the Wall Street Journal. Thank you guys for coming out of your summer hibernation to join us on the podcast. We will be back with our new season, our 14th season, on September 2nd. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Milan.
Thank you.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grand Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production, brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.